Welcome to the webinar. Really appreciate everybody being here. We'll give it perhaps just one more minute for a few stragglers to come on onto the live stream, and then we'll kick things off. But just whilst we're waiting, a bit of a kind of recap of the focus for today. Really, just to kind of talk a little bit about leading remote teams and some of the kind of trials and tribulations and opportunity and possibilities that come from that. Cool. Well, I guess one of the points of running remote teams is everyone trying to be in the right place at the same time. So probably good to kick things off just 2 minutes after the hour. Just as an introduction, I'm Jack Thorogood, CEO and founder of Native Teams. For those that don't know, Native Teams is a combination of payment tools and employment options, really to facilitate, I guess the remote working environment where we can connect and I guess remove some of the friction between talent and opportunity so that talent can stay working in the country where that person wants to be based, but they can have the opportunity to work for great projects and great clients in other countries. So we kind of provide the payment tools and the employment options and I guess the compliance and the documentation and the payment rails behind the scenes to facilitate that. Delighted to have Gent join me from Maxxhire. Perhaps Gent, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, of course. And thank you, Jack. Thanks for having me. And I guess it's you and I speaking. So I think it's kind of the first lesson of just working remotely and making sure that this is interactive. So I'm Gent Dedushi. I'm the CEO of Maxxhire. Maxxhire is on a mission to connect US-based companies with talents and developing and emerging markets. We make it really easy for companies to go in, search, connect with talent anywhere in the world. To date, we have about 10,000 candidates in 30 plus countries. And we're really trying to solve the day one of finding the talent and then leveraging native teams to cover some of the things you talked about as far as payments, taxes, compliance, and other things.
Great. With the 30 plus countries, Gent, are there any kind of hotspots? Are there any areas where you tend to see more talent emerging from, or is it pretty distributed?
I would say it's pretty distributed. I mean, you're always going to see the names that U.S. companies have been hiring for a long time, right? So you think of Poland. Poland's a hotspot, Bulgaria, Brazil, Colombia, Costa Rica, right? So I think we kind of focused in on Europe and Latin America, and we're yet to expand to other regions, but you'll definitely see a little bit more of talent in those specific countries where they just, hired for a long time.
Cool. No, fantastic. So just as a kind of a recap, the title of the webinar was Leading from Afar. And I think what's going to be quite interesting during the course of this one is how much of it is leading from afar, how much of it is spending time with the talent in the different countries where talent might be, and perhaps some of the alternative ways we might have to collaborate, but that's something we'll come on to. Goal of the webinar really is to look at a couple of the hot topics around running and managing and working as part of, indeed, remote and distributed teams. So how to build trust and transparency in remote teams, how to keep teams engaged and connected as a business scales and grows, and also how to potentially lead and mentor a team, whether that's as the overall company leader or a mid-level manager, or just somebody who's running a kind of a sub team within a wider division. So those are some of the topics we hope to cover. Just as a reminder, I'd love to get any questions. So if anybody has any questions they'd like to share during the course of the webinar, we'll go through it. We had a couple of early questions prior to the webinar, which we tried to put in some kind of an order so we can hopefully touch on a couple of kind of main topics and themes as we go through the webinar. Again, before we start, actually, however, we've been running a survey online from Native Teams on our LinkedIn channel, just to kind of look at, to ask the question. The question is, what's the one key factor in making remote teams truly successful? And there's a choice of 4 different options: clear processes and structure, strong leadership and trust, the right tools and technology, and a great company culture. The results are quite interesting. I don't know if you've got any thoughts in terms of those kind of 4 distinct areas. What would you say is the kind of the most important one key factor for making a remote team truly successful?
Yeah, so I think the process and the structure is really important, right? Because typically if you're doing that in an office, it's really easy to manage. if you're onboarding people across the world with different rules and compliance and contracts, if you don't do that well, people are going to feel like, there's something missing there, right? So I think that's really, really important with onboarding is the process, making sure you have a strong process and you have a stringent structure as to what are the steps that you need to take. But I think the bigger one, the more important one, is kind of just strong leadership and trust. I think when you have a remote team, what I try to do is really focus on result oriented, right? It's no longer as important if you sign in 2 minutes late or 3 minutes late, but it's really more about making sure the team has clear goals and objectives,
Yeah.
and you have a strong leadership team to work with the team to make sure that it's truly result oriented and the things that they need to get done are getting done versus I took a 30-minute lunch break instead of a 5-minute lunch break, right? So I think that's really the strong thing for me.
Yeah, no, great. It's interesting, kind of looking at obviously because we posted the survey, we've been able to see some of the results, and the one that perhaps gets the answer that the kind of the one key factor when it comes to making remote teams truly successful that perhaps gets a slightly lower billing from the respondees than I was expecting was a great company culture, and perhaps that will be a topic we touch upon a little bit later, but certainly I've found that the importance of culture is vital because having a strong company culture is what seems to give people a reason to kind of get up and go and hopefully do the right thing and I guess justify the trust that's placed in them and what have you. But we can perhaps touch upon that one. The other one actually quite interesting was, and this was one which nobody really, well, a few respondents thought this was particularly important. And that's the kind of the right tools and technology. And one of the interesting things I've observed, having worked in and run remote and distributed teams for I don't know, like an embarrassing 15 years or something like that, I think it's been now. It's how the tools are basically exactly the same. I was kind of thinking, so when we were chatting earlier, obviously we kind of use Google Meets on some of our previous conversations. We're using Zoom today, but actually like back in the day, 15 years ago, I think I used Skype for that kind of a thing. Internally within native teams, we use Slack for our conversations. I think sort of back in the day when I first started to work remotely, we used ICQ or something like that. We use Asana for our project management tools, and we use like Basecamp or something like that a long, long time ago. Basically, those kind of three fundamental blocks of tools, as all that anybody needs, they've evolved, but actually, I think there's not been so many sort of fundamental enhancements over and above those kind of three kind of text, chat, video calls, and project management sets of software that are kind of still used today in much the same way as they were, 15 years ago or something, which is interesting.
I think if you asked the question, that same question to your point, maybe 10 years ago, 12 years ago, 8 years ago, it would probably rank much higher.
Yeah.
But we've been leveraging these tools now for so long, especially, post-COVID, that we're just so used to them that they really don't make that much of a difference because the tools are great. And I think we're used to it. It's almost become something you don't think about.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Cool. So if we kind of start to think a little bit about remote work, how would you say, again, what's your kind of feeling for how it's evolved? I guess particularly since the pandemic, how have you kind of seen the landscape change when it comes to remote working and how people like to work?
Yeah, so I think the pandemic was really a crucial point in all of this. I think when the pandemic happened and post-pandemic, you really started to think of remote work and trying to define it a little bit further, right? Because you can be remote within the same city, you can be remote within the same country, or you can be remote anywhere in the globe, right? And so I think, in the last year or two, a lot of companies are starting to speak up against remote work, right? We've had some CEOs trying to bring people back in. And I think there's always going to be that debate. But, when I think of remote work, I'm really thinking of borderless work, right?
Yeah.
So having a distributed team, if I have a developer in Brazil and a graphic designer in Romania, it's much different than having a full remote team in New York City, for example, right? So I think companies have really started to see that value. I think another thing that I'm starting to see a lot of is companies are starting to build out these global tech hubs.
Hmm.
So, they'll build one in Poland, they'll build one in Turkey, where they'll go in, they'll build an office. At least they have some center where people can get together.
Yeah.
People tend to be remotely within that country. So I think borderless remote work is here to stay. It's always going to be a discussion and a debate, but there's just so much amazing talent out there, and we shouldn't be limited by, by our borders simply.
Yeah. So a couple of points which I think are really interesting from what you just discussed there. First off, and this, I always used to think I was a complete pedant when people would ask, do I have a remote team? I tend to say, well, it's a distributed team technically, but I guess you could call it remote. You kind of use the phrase borderless as well. How do you kind of think about the evolving kind of descriptions and descriptors that one might use for these kind of teams? Do they kind of, broadly speaking, all mean the same thing, or do you think there's still kind of quite distinct differences between a remote team, a distributed team, and indeed a borderless team?
Yeah, so I think it depends on where that talent sits. Like I'll give you a perfect example. So I had a buddy of mine who was looking to hire for an open position, and he found a really good candidate in New York. And the candidate pushed back and said, listen, I don't want to come into an office. I want to work remotely. So, well, great. If that's the case, let me open up this job position to the rest of the world. And he got so many more applications, so many better candidates that he ended up hiring someone completely in a different country, right? So I think, again, when we read in the news of when people say remote work, it tends to be usually within that city, within that country. And I think of borderless outside the US, if that's where you're headquartered. That's really kind of how I try to define it, or to your point, distributed. I used to work at Elastic, and the entire team was distributed. We had offices, but we had people in so many different countries, and it was such a great culture.
Cool. I think the nice idea about the borderless descriptor reminds me of Wise transfer, what was TransferWise, and their kind of borderless accounts, and that whole idea that actually talent kind of flows totally seamlessly, irrespective of borders. I think is a really important mindset for one to kind of take and adapt to be honest with you. It kind of removes the rigidity, literally removes the borders, I guess, in terms of that kind of approach for finding talent and for finding the right people for the roles rather than people in the right place for the roles, which is kind of a big sea change. One of the kind of questions that I've been asked quite a bit in the past, actually, one of our attendees has asked the question is around, well, the question specifically asked us now is about accountability, and the question was, how do we ensure the accountability of staff hired for project-based work, particularly when handling sensitive data, and what measures might be put in place to address that? So I think that's kind of one half of the question, and perhaps we can look at that one first. But that slightly opens the door to perhaps a bigger question, which is kind of trust generally on that side of things. Perhaps before we get into the kind of the wider trust topic, Gent, I don't know if you've got any thoughts in terms of how have you seen it when your US-based sort of clients are working with talent outside of the US? How do they kind of, how does the kind of accountability and the trust, particularly when it comes to that sensitive data, how does that get handled successfully?
Well, I think with sensitive data, that's like it's almost like a legal question, right? I think a lot of US-based companies will have a lot of those questions up front. And again, I think depending on the way the contracts are structured, leveraging an EOR platform like Native Teams really helps ease their mind when it comes to sensitive data. And there's usually a lot of work up front on that, and then they get comfortable, and it's no longer really a question.
Yeah.
On accountability, on if we're talking about just our employees, again, I think it's really, really important to set goals, objectives, and have weekly touch points, have monthly checkpoints.
Yeah.
And also be free to go to your leadership team, because we are working remotely, and so when you're in an office, you can very easily go to someone across the desk and ask a question. Sometimes we don't feel comfortable when we're doing that remotely, right? So I think having that open communication back and forth with your leadership team via Slack, via Zoom, or any video conferencing, right, to make sure that you're on the right path, that you're working on the right thing, is important. And I think as a company, again, it's all about results. It doesn't matter, if you worked 80 hours or 100 hours,
Yeah.
are the tasks being done? And I think that definitely takes time to build. And especially when you onboard new employees, right, you kind of stay a little bit closer. And as you
Yeah.
kind of build that trust over time, you get more comfortable with one another.
Yeah, great. I think when it comes to these particular topics, from my experience with it, so first off, if
Hmm.
we kind of think about the accountability and this specific question about the kind of the trustworthiness and accountability when handling sensitive data, to be frank on that one, I'd say really there's not any massive difference between hiring somebody on a remote basis for that compared to hiring somebody who's going to be in the office. There's probably as much opportunity for somebody in an office to kind of, I don't know, sneak in a pen drive and steal some data like that, as there would be for somebody to kind of, be working in a more nefarious manner remotely as well. I think it comes down to choosing the right people, as you say, having the kind of legal framework in place with proper employment contracts and IP protections and the like. I think there's obviously some additional steps that one can take. I know, for example, with our developers and what we've seen with some of our clients, there'll be IP address whitelisting and some kind of some natural steps that one can take on this side of things. But to be frank, a lot of that is just general kind of good data management hygiene that you would do if everybody was in the same office. It doesn't matter
Exactly.
sort of whether they're more distributed on that side of things or not. I think when it comes down to the kind of the general topic of accountability and trust and that side of things, so that's really interesting. And I'd say actually kind of I know one of the questions that we've sometimes been asked over the last few months, particularly as you mentioned earlier, again, there's a few kind of higher profile back to the office type examples on Amazon and Tesla and what have you. To be frank, I think that comes down a lot to one's own individual management style. So we can perhaps a little bit later in this conversation touch upon the benefits of remote and distributed working versus everyone being in the office. But I think fundamentally, as a leader, as a business owner, as a manager, you either have to have the mindset where you're prepared to trust people or you can't trust people. And if you're somebody that can't trust people, then you're probably going to make sure everybody comes back to the office so you can kind of stand looming over their shoulder to check that they're, I don't know, kind of not playing solitaire or whatever and they're doing their work, or you're somebody that can just kind of can trust people. One of the things I would say on that one, I think you made this point as well, Gent, is that for sure you have to be somebody that's capable of trusting your colleagues to kind of do the right thing and do what you employed them to do. But to be frank, you also, I think, can underpin some of that with experience, whether that's the experience of kind of putting in, as you say, the milestones to kind of to give people some checkpoints to kind of check that they're generally speaking doing what you're expecting them to be doing, but for their own benefit as well, to kind of to make sure they have the opportunity to kind of raise any questions or issues that may have cropped up in their work. But I know over the years that that I've been working with distributed and remote teams, I feel I've developed a little bit of a sixth sense in terms of what I expect to see as output, and most of the time I don't ever think anything of it. But after a little while, if you kind of you have that sixth sense of what you do expect to see as output, and that I guess isn't just experience of remote working, that's just kind of experience of work. You kind of know what people can do in a day. If that starts to not be materializing, that's perhaps when the alarm bells might ring and you might kind of dig in a little bit more and then put in place some of the performance management tools that, again, to be honest with you, are probably not wildly different in a remote environment as they would be in a in-office environment.
And and if I can just add to that,
Yeah,
because I think that's very important. You talked about that sixth sense that you've developed over time, right? What we've also learned is when you onboard employees, it's very important to be upfront about that sixth sense. Like, here's what our expectations are. Because sometimes, even when you hire someone remotely, it's their first time, right? Working for an international company, working from home, working remotely. And so they also don't really know what's important and kind of what you're looking for. So I think when they come on board, setting that up front and being transparent is important because they tend to then focus on those things to make sure that they're doing what they need to do.
yeah, no, absolutely. How do you find different time zones kind of work and how would you advise your clients to kind of handle different time zones? Because I appreciate a lot of your um such as yourself and your clients are based in the US and you've got the talent distributed on that kind of borderless basis, as you mentioned. How do you kind of tend to advise people on time zones, and how have you found different time zones impact productivity and the way people work?
So my advice always is make sure you have at least 2 or 4 hour block between those time zones where you can connect, right? Because there's always going to be work. You're not going to have to stay online with someone on video chat for 8 hours a day.
Yeah.
But at least if you have a 2 or 4 hour window where both time zones can connect, that seems to work magically for us and our
Yeah.
clients. So besides that, I haven't really seen any issues with it. I mean, there's always going to be, an email coming in at 2 a.m., 3 a.m., but also kind of respecting, that time zone and respecting each other is important. But no issues whatsoever from our end on that side.
Yeah, I must admit, I'd agree. I think that a degree of crossover, sort of 2 to 4 hours or something like that, is plenty. But you certainly don't really need that kind of full, 8 hours coverage. And I guess it's one of the advantages of remote work for the colleague themselves who's working remotely. And it's one of the kind of perks that you as an employer can offer for remote work is that people do work in kind of sensible, sociable time zones. There wouldn't be much fun when it comes to remote working if, I don't know, let's say you're in India and you're having to work for a US client and that client is insisting you work on US time zones because it means you're, I don't know, up at 2 in the morning and going to bed at 10 or something along those lines. It really kind of doesn't make much sense for anybody on that side of things. I must admit, from a personal perspective, I've always quite enjoyed a slightly asynchronous time zone. Sometimes I know when I go to the US and it means that finally all of my colleagues log off and stop sending me emails at, I know, 6 o'clock in the afternoon. And actually it means I can get on and spend an afternoon on kind of quality work or what have you actually works really well. But as you say, that kind of time just to kind of properly sync up once a day is really important. I think one of the things I've found is really beneficial as well is kind of consistency. So it doesn't matter when people are online, but you kind of know that they're broadly speaking going to be online at a certain time. That's always quite helpful. I know when you kind of assume that somebody's always going to be there from, I don't know, 2 o'clock in the afternoon to 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and then they're not. That's more of a problem than anything else I've generally experienced.
Yeah, and people tend to be flexible, right? Like I've seen people take calls at 2 a.m., 3 a.m., but they don't happen very often. Once in a while, you have to do it, especially, you got to go with the mindset that if you're working for a US based client, it's not going to be your local time zone.
Yeah.
As long as you're flexible, again, it comes down to trust as well. It tends to work pretty well.
Yeah. No, great. So I know it's a kind of topic we touched on a little bit earlier on, the kind of idea of the borderless employment and I think one of the kind of the phrases you used was the value of hiring beyond borders, and I guess kind of borders ceasing to become an impediment when it comes to hiring people. What have you generally seen have been the kind of the main advantages, and what when you're talking with your clients, and indeed when they're talking to you, what do either you see or do they see as the kind of the biggest benefits of hiring beyond borders? Is it just kind of, I don't know, cost or something, or actually kind of is it better access to kind of absolute the right talent irrespective of where they're based? What are the kind of the main drivers, do you think?
So I think they start off with cost, right? They're looking for cost efficiencies, but very quickly realize that that's probably not the most valuable thing, right? It's really just opening up to the world, right? And finding that skill any part of the world, right? If you're looking at the US, for example, population is 3 to 400 million. If you open that up to 7 billion plus people, you're going to find some amazing talent.
Yeah.
And then I think the other thing is they typically need to see one success story. They hire someone and they don't realize how some of these people in some parts of the world, how driven and hungry they are, right? Because this might be an opportunity that they don't have in their local markets. And it's always that drive. I had a lot of clients kind of come and also visit these employees in different countries, and they're just absolutely amazed at how driven and how motivated they are to do better and learn. Or sometimes they don't get that same sense for someone who has a ton of opportunities in New York, for example. So I think it starts off with cost. Very quickly, it expands into just skill set, amazing talents, and then a drive that I talked about.
Yeah, I think the I guess the broadening of a talent pool probably kind of goes both ways a little bit as well. So on the one hand, for sure, it's you know, once you kind of remove the borders, you're looking for the right talent, irrespective of where that might be, and that kind of really broadens the pool of available candidates. But to be frank, that probably kind of goes both ways, and you've kind of got people who are looking for just the right opportunity, just the right job for them as well. And that might well not be in their hometown. That they might think, well, look, I really want to work on a project that's like this, and if I find that kind of project, I'm going to commit all into that side of things. And so actually, if they have a broader scope of projects available to them, you're probably going to get way more commitment because they've gone out, they've kind of sought the thing that's kind of the one. It's the thing that's just perfect for them, the career that's just perfect for them, rather than the one that's kind of on their doorstep. So I guess definitely goes both ways on that side of things. I suspect.
Yeah, I think there's a ton of value. I mean, I think one of the reasons we've seen so much interest in Maxxhire, we've had so many candidates sign up. I think there's the value prop on the talent side is really high as well.
Yeah.
I think one, we tend to see that, again, they're really excited to work for an international organization. Maybe that opportunity doesn't exist in the local market. Second, there's kind of like three levels of salary and compensation.
Yeah.
Right? You typically have the local market salary and compensation. Then you have an outsourcing firm which sets up a shop in that market, but are still working with international companies, but it's almost like
Yeah.
a middleman. And then the high level, the best level that people are looking for is working directly for a US company.
Yeah.
Because salaries tend to go 2x, 5x. We've seen as much as 10x. So I think all of that, and then plus just a better work-life balance, because most likely if they're working for an international organization, they are going to be, remote. So I think the value prop is strong on both sides, and that's why I love kind of what's happening, and
Yeah.
between, again, EOR enabling that is really important.
When it comes to the kind of compensation side of things, I I know there's many different ways that people look at this in terms of, do they pay sort of local market rate? Do they pay market rate of the home country or whatever? How I think we've generally kind of remunerated within native teams, our own colleagues, and how I've generally seen our clients work as well is it tends to be a much kind of I guess kind of steeper hockey stick or steeper curve or as it were, and I think a much kind of greater way for people who are working remotely to increase their remuneration much faster than if they were just kind of working in the local environment. So if I take native teams, with a kind of degree of discretion here, I would say we tend to pay I'd say way better than average rates in country because we're looking to find the right people, not the kind of the lowest cost people, particularly for the more sort of entry level positions. But to be frank, by the time we get to kind of top level positions, C team level positions, really location is irrelevant. We pay everybody exactly the same rate, whether they're based in with the kind of the same salary band. I mean, whether they're based in the US or the UK or Serbia or Macedonia or wherever it might be. Because to be frank, that level of talent, kind of the world is their oyster. They can work for whoever they want to, wherever they want to work. So you kind of can't start to think, well, hang on a second, perhaps I can get away with paying these people a little bit less. I think when you get to that kind of absolute top level, you have to be paying a kind of almost like a global market rate on that side of things. But I think that's a win for both parties, to be honest with you, because for an employer, it means you're just kind of picking the right talent for the job, irrespective of where that talent is. But then for the employee, you've perhaps had a slightly steeper trajectory in terms of how much your earnings have increased over the years in perhaps a kind of a shorter period of time than it would otherwise take if you didn't have that opportunity for remote work. One of the other kind of questions that kind of comes to mind and this is actually an area where I personally I think I've probably made the most errors when we're kind of talking about kind of compensation and remuneration and what have you. How have you generally kind of looked at cultural differences? Because cultural differences can actually often be exacerbated by earning differentials and stuff like that. What's been your experience there, Gent?
Yeah, I was thinking about that as you were talking about kind of like this global, pay scale, if you will, right? Uh, Culture is everything. And that tends to affect things there as well, especially on salary compensation. So, for example, in the US, you'll have someone work 3, 4 years and not ask for a raise, right?
Yeah,
In other parts of the world, typically 3 to 6 months, people are knocking down on your door and saying, "Hey, it's been 6 months. I've done this amazing work.
yeah,
We need to talk," right? And so I think it's really important to understand that culture. And to your point, you probably made mistakes. I've made a ton of mistakes as well.
yeah.
I really think about that portion. So anytime we're building out salary levels for our employees, it's okay. Like, what is that typical culture, and what are some
Yeah.
things we can avoid so that we don't get into that type of trouble?
Yeah, I guess I've made cultural mistakes like that, and I've made kind of just general maths mistakes like that on in my earlier days, particularly. So I know the biggest cultural faux pas I feel I've ever made was, well, an unexpected one. I gave somebody a pay rise, but I didn't give that manager a pay rise. So the pay differential between the manager and the subordinate decreased, and the manager just went absolutely off the wall angry because I hadn't given him a pay rise to kind of commensurate for the pay rise I've given the junior reporting into him, and that was completely unexpected. I didn't see that one coming whatsoever. And the maths one, which is just kind of something which is worth having in mind, particularly for those of us based in the UK and the US, where we're used to dealing with growth salaries, so gross salaries. So if somebody was to kind of, if I was to look for a job and I'd see the kind of the salary level, I'd think, right, that's the gross salary, and then I'm going to have to pay tax off of that and social contributions off of that. In a lot of the countries where we work, people work in net salaries. They don't really care. They don't even think about what the state takes. They just kind of think about what they're going to get. And I think one of the first jobs I offered to somebody in Macedonia about 15 years or so ago, and I had, I don't know, agreed, like, let's just say it was €1,000 a month or something along those lines, and I was still €12,000 a year, and I was thinking, great, it's going to be €12,000 a year, kind of that's it, total cost. And they were thinking, well, that's what, they're going to get €1,000 in their bank every month, and then it's going to cost me an extra 50% or whatever on top of that. Didn't even think about that one. So there's a few kind of cultural differences like that, I guess, when it comes to remuneration.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, to your point, leadership also affected by culture, even between sometimes men and women, right?
Yeah,
We tend to have a lot of women in leadership positions, and sometimes that can cause some issues. But I think culture is something that has been instilled within us for a long time, right? So I think just going in with a good understanding, doing your research, and then just trying to avoid some of those
yeah,
issues ahead of time. But to your point, anyone who is going to go start hiring remotely are going to make these mistakes.
yeah.
It's just inevitable.
Yeah. One thing I would just say, and forgive me, it's not exactly on topic, but I can't let the opportunity pass up because it's kind of a bit of a cause I'm a bit of a champion of. So when it comes to I know you're talking more about the kind of the cultural issues of kind of in some countries where gender can have an impact on kind of leadership and leadership perceptions. Just when it comes to the salary side of things, and this is just an observation, which I'm sure is as applicable in a non-remote environment as a remote environment. But one thing we've really tried to be conscious of is making sure we are proactive when it comes to pay rises and don't just react to when somebody asks for pay rises. And one of the biggest differences there is, and again, this is a generalization, of course, but we've tend and yeah, we've really tried very hard to be. I mean, we have more than 50% of our colleagues are women at native teams, but I've generally found that women are less inclined to ask for pay rises than men. And if you're not careful, you really don't monitor this side of things, then you'll end up by default paying men more than women just because I guess as a generalization, men are a little bit more proactive when it comes to asking for a pay rise. And so again, we try to be very conscious about offering pay rises. I know this is not relevant to the remote working side of things and is applicable to everything, but I guess I'm really kind of quite passionate to make sure that there is gender parity when it comes to pay and what have you. Just kind of back on the remuneration side of things, and this was a question which has been asked by one of the attendees today. Is about performance management. So obviously kind of pay and pay rises and what have you go hand in hand with high performance and people performing to the level that one would expect. What kind of tools, Gent, have you generally looked to use? Well, whether that's specific tools or processes, at least, have you looked to use when it comes to performance management to make sure that that those kind of remote and distributed teams that are working at the level that you might hope that they would be?
To be honest, we haven't found a great tool. We have built our own, call it sheets of things that we're looking for in some of these remote teams. And it's really specific to us, right? And it's hard because depending on which role you're doing, that's going to make an impact. And so we've built our own. We typically do every 6 months, and then we'll kind of do check-ins. We'll do like a weekly check-in, just kind of how things are going. But 6 months is when it comes to performance management. We found that I think in the US, they tend to be more closer to the 1 year. But I think just like if you're looking at Europe, you need to do them a little bit more often. So we'll do about 6 months of it.
Yeah, no, great.
What tool have you used? Do you have any tools you can recommend?
No, to be honest, much the same. We tend to, I mean, we have processes, so we tend to do a quarterly performance review. And we also include a kind of a 6 monthly anonymous 360 process as well, just to kind of get the feedback going the other way. We've tended to kind of go for the more frequent performance reviews because I guess I don't want to say we're super easygoing, but we've tended to find that having more frequent but perhaps slightly less officious type performance reviews, it gives people an opportunity to perhaps speak their mind as well, where they might not necessarily feel like they have a forum to do that otherwise. So that's generally speaking how we've handled it. Also, we found that quarterly reviews allows us to kind of to intervene in a kind of a less kind of, hey, we're going to have some major intervention call basis, just kind of intervene when we start to see something slipping or sliding, or perhaps despite somebody's best intentions, it not necessarily kind of working out as well as we might hope. It gives an opportunity to get in early to kind of give a little bit of a course correct, so that hopefully sort of a minor course correction can be done rather than something a little bit more radical if the performance reviews weren't quite so frequent.
Yeah, the other thing too is, I've worked at some pretty large companies like IBM and Google, and anytime performance reviews would come up, I mean, it required so much work.
Yeah.
So obviously for remote teams, it's very, very important that you take them very seriously, especially if you're results driven.
Yeah.
And we talked about goals and objectives and all of that. But at the same time, we try to make it where it's not a cumbersome process for the person going through that performance review, right? So we try to make it not as stressful, not as time consuming. This is not something that should take you a week or 2 weeks to put together. Because when you do that, people also come to those meetings with a lot more energy and kind of just, openness to talk about some of those things, where you say, hey, write me, 10-page paper on what you've done in the last 3 to 6 months. It kind of just slows people down. And so just going through that process myself at some of these large organizations, we've tried to simplify that as much as possible. And we'll try to do most of the work on our end.
Yeah. I think one of the things I'd add as well, actually, that kind of has really helped make our performance reviews more meaningful and, to be frank, easier to administer for people who, perhaps might be managers who I don't know, aren't so experienced or don't enjoy the performance review side of things too much. And that's really trying to be very clear about expectations from roles, KPIs, where there can be KPIs associated with roles as well, because that kind of gives something that's in black and white. It perhaps overcomes some of the the kind of the cultural communication issues that might arise as well, and just kind of allows one to kind of look at performance compared to expectation and have a kind of more, I guess, kind of objective conversation around those things, rather than it being sort of two people's differences of opinion or whatever. So I think definitely the more we've pushed on KPIs and expectations, that's been super beneficial. It's also been quite helpful when it comes to kind of managing pay rise conversations and stuff like that, and giving people targets to aim towards, and if they achieve those targets, then you can kind of deliver the bonus or whatever it was that you'd agreed at that point as well.
Yeah.
Cool. So one of the kind of sort of observations I made at the very start of this webinar was that the title of the webinar being leading from afar, but kind of on the flip side of that, how often, again, do you end up actually spending time in person with your remote or distributed workforce?
So I would say between our clients and us, usually once in 6 months, or even having like a yearly conference, if there's a sales kickoff and
Yeah,
you're invited, but just kind of going and spending the week. I think it's more about just once a year, twice a year, going and just spending quality time with the team, right? And it doesn't mean, hey, let's just go out to dinner and have drinks, but 1 or 2 days might be training, one day might be an outing where you're going to go and
yeah,
have some fun. I think it also gives the team access to the leadership team, especially again, given with remote tools, maybe it's a little bit harder to kind of connect via Slack. But I think giving people that access and just connecting and again, combining it training with some fun tends to work really well. And a lot of our clients kind of follow that similar, strategy.
yeah. Do
What
you kind
about
of so from our side, it varies quite a bit. It depends a little bit, I think. So we try and just generally within the company, we have a couple of initiatives where we try and bring as many people together as we possibly can do. Just, I guess, for context, our team is now 300 people or thereabouts within native teams. Grown a lot actually over the last 4 years. So I think as we went into 2021 into 2022, we were like 20 people. 22 into 23, it was, I don't know, perhaps 90 people. 23 into 24 was 150-ish, and then it kind of doubled again last year, something along those lines. So we've kind of had a lot of growth in terms of the team, and that has slightly changed the frequency of how we get together, and a little bit kind of the dynamics of how we get together as well. I kind of remember back we launched the company back in coronavirus days, or pandemic days, I should say. And yeah, I think a couple of times in that first year we hired an Airbnb. We could just about fit all of the team in, and we'd kind of go and spend a week working from there together, which to be honest was amazing. It was a kind of great change from the social distancing that we had over here in the UK. To be frank, every time I did one of those sessions, I was thinking, oh my God, the whole company's going to go down with coronavirus and we're going to be doomed. But we managed to get through those things. But that was great. And that, to be honest with you, that I think sets a lot of the culture for the business that has really prevailed to this day. We then try and have nowadays, now we're much bigger, we try and have a couple of, to be honest with you, pretty much informal, sort of fun-based get-togethers, just to have teams get to know one another. Do that in a couple of different ways. We have we call it the Bitola Marathon. Bitola is the small city in Macedonia where the company was founded. And it's not actually a marathon; it's a 5 kilometer, 10 kilometer, 21K run or walk or kind of crawl or not even quite finish it, whichever way the team members are feeling. But that's always been great to kind of just have a reason to bring people together. And we're in like I think 35 different countries or something now, our colleagues. So to have them come together to meet people who they may not have met in person for the first time, to meet people from countries where perhaps they've never met somebody from that country ever before in person, they have just been fantastic, and we've done them, and I hope we kind of managed to do those for a longer term as well. We also try a little bit of a kind of a work stroke have fun session. So every summer for the last couple of summers, we've hired some villas in Greece and have tried to kind of have as many of the team members go and work from there for I don't know, 3 or 4 days, something like that. We can't obviously get everybody together in the same place, but just to kind of have a good amount of sort of throughput of colleagues to make sure people get some fun, they spend time, sure, doing a bit of work together, but just kind of chatting and kind of drinking, dare I say, whatever it might be with one another, just to kind of really enjoy one another's company on that side of things. And that's been really beneficial. And interestingly on that one, so we always used to do it by team. So we'd like have the design team and the legal team and the finance team and different teams kind of go sort of do that kind of a session, whether that's the Greece ones or kind of other kind of get-togethers, perhaps twice a year, something like that. But actually, what has kind of somewhat surprised us is the most effective and the most beneficial and the ones where you can kind of in crude terms see the most tangible return on investment is when it's just completely random people go to work together. Perhaps that person from the customer success team ends up
Yeah.
having a great time, kind of in Greece or wherever it might be with somebody from the finance team. And then the next time the CX team needs something from the finance team, they've kind of got better bonds there. They kind of got on well with one another, and just kind of collaboration goes way more smoothly. So that's kind of tended to work pretty well for us on that side of things. Is it we've also tried to keep that up a little bit, even on a remote basis. So sometimes when we have those offsites, we'll try and get people that can't attend to kind of come in online. It's not quite the same, but I think if one's running a distributed or remote team, quite important to do. We've like, as I mentioned earlier, kind of half of our more than half of our team are female, and most of our team members are somewhere between 27 and 33. So like a bunch of them have had kids over the last little while, and actually to kind of give people a way to kind of still participate and not feel excluded because they can't travel because they've had kids or whatever has been quite an important thing for us to manage as well. Do you ever kind of run like an ROI slide rule over these things, Gent, or is it kind of a little bit, oh, well, that was good fun or worked out well or whatever? How do you look at it?
It's always a year after when you're doing the math. You're like, well, we probably spent a little bit too much, but it was well worth it.
Yeah.
So if you don't have a clear kind of, and we're not at the size that you guys are, so we're a little bit smaller, but I think as we scale, you're definitely going to have to look at some of those costs. But to your point about ROI, I think just at the end of the day, we're people, we're humans, right? And we need that interaction. And as much as remote work is great, sometimes we just need together and just have a good time. And I don't think you can really put, an ROI on that. But
Yeah.
I think once we get to your scale, we'll have to start looking at expenses a little bit more.
Yeah, no, I think that's a fair point. To be honest with you, I think there's various ways that one can post rationalize this. So yeah, we don't have like one massive HQ, super expensive office or whatever. So I think we're actually spending a bit more of people having quality time working together is really important. And to be frank, the kind of the least objective, the least kind of return on investment focused approach one can take on this one, it's quite good fun as well. And everyone kind of works pretty hard, to be honest with you, and actually to have some time getting some satisfaction from work by building those kind of personal relationships, I think is really important. As you say, you kind of can't really put a price on it, and you can't probably justify or kind of measure the ROI as well. But definitely important when one.
I think at scale, just working at some of the larger companies, the thing that I wanted to highlight, which is really really important, is the more you grow, you're kind of in these bubbles, right? So you're in the finance bubble, you're in the marketing bubble, and when you really bring those people together, when you're working on deals, when you're working with customers, it's much easier because now you know who that person is, and getting things done tends to go much quicker, right?
Yeah.
So really, really important to, again, just getting together, having a good time, doing some trainings, and yeah.
Yeah, no, fantastic, great stuff. Cool. So I think we kind of cover most of the key areas we wanted to look at. If there's any further questions from anybody attending, happy to take those now. Again, I don't know if there's anything that you think, excuse me, we should have covered that we haven't done already.
No, I think it was a great conversation. Thanks for hosting this.
Cool. No, it's been a real pleasure. Been thoroughly enjoyable, and I think we kind of covered a good few areas in the wider space. If anybody does have any kind of questions on a follow up to the webinar, please feel free to drop us a line. I guess there's an email address that would have been linked to the invitations we'd have seen. Really happy to take any questions. They kind of crop up, even if you kind of don't think about them until this evening or tomorrow or whatever it might be. Kind of, I guess, as you probably can see, both Gent and I are pretty passionate about remote and distributed working and all the benefits it brings to people. So happy to kind of take questions whenever they might crop up. I guess on that side of things, then really appreciate everybody attending this one. Again, particularly really appreciate your time on this. It's been a pleasure to have the opportunity to talk through these topics together. So yeah, I guess we're good. Thanks very much indeed, everybody. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay. Bye.
Bye bye.